Hello everyone, welcome to Keen Ian. I'd like to start this video off with a little bit of news, which is that for the first time ever I was recognized in the street by somebody through making these videos, here on YouTube, on this very channel. And it was something that caught me off guard. It wasn't something that I was expecting in the slightest. And I feel like in no small part this recognition was due to these ranking videos, such as this. I don't make a lot of ranking videos, but I certainly make my fair share. And I'll set the scene of what happened. I was walking down the street near where I live, and a car was passing in the opposite direction. And the windows went down as the car was getting near. And inside the car, I'm not sure if it's the driver or a passenger, perhaps. But anyway, somebody shouted, "Ranker, ranker," and then that sort of passed and sped off to a degree, and I waved at them, and I shouted, "Thanks for your continued support of my YouTube channel." I'm not sure if they heard me, but I really do feel like at that point in time, that the channel had maybe hit a crossroads, similar to the car in many ways, hit a crossroads. And, I feel like at this point in time, I wanted to make a video that's, another ranking video effectively, strike while the iron's hot, and kind of, onwards and upwards, I suppose, use it as kind of like a good omen in many ways. So, Roxy Music, there's 8 studio albums by Roxy Music in total. 1972 to 1982, so this year marks the 50th anniversary of their first album, and I believe they have announced a tour. Yeah, looking forward to to seeing them when I can. And also as well, it marks the 40th anniversary of their final album. They haven't put out a studio album in 40 years. So we've got 8 albums in total, and I believe all of them, as far as I'm concerned anyway, are pretty good. They didn't put out a stinker. So they've got quite a good legacy, and it's kind of, I feel like there's 2 parts of Roxy Music. There's 72 to 75, and then there's 79 really to 82. There's 2 periods really. I generally speaking, and not to ruin things, but I generally speaking prefer the 72 to 75 era. But yeah, they're a great band. One of my favorite bands of all time. Very unique, very different, which is 2 of the same things, I suppose. I'm turning into a bit of a thesaurus already, but it's a fine group. I haven't been a big fan of them for a long, a huge point of time, I suppose. But since I started collecting vinyl, I got into them. I picked up For Your Pleasure about 6.5, 7 years ago now at this point, and I haven't really looked back since. So as it's the 50th anniversary of their first album, it's the 40th anniversary of their final album at this point in time anyway. We'll it's a great time to put a ranking video together, and I'm in full Roxy Music mood. I've managed this kind of recently to get hold of the final few Roxy Music albums and needed to complete my collection of all 8 albums. So let's crack on with things and have a look at album number 8 of 8, my least favourite Roxy Music album, which is this. It's Fleshy Blood, many people's favourite, least favourite, should I say, Roxy Music album. This is the one that always languishes at the bottom of people. I've noticed online, this seems to, stand at the bottom of the barrel, really, of Roxy Music albums. That's not to say it's a bad album, generally. It's really not. I think if you compare it to Roxy Music albums, it doesn't really stand that, high and mighty at all. It's a little bit of a weak, it's a bit of a weakling in terms of its material. But in terms of albums that were released back in 1980, around this sort of period, it's actually pretty good. It stands quite strong compared to those. But I think at this point as well, Roxy Music was starting to get increasingly more sounding like Brian Ferry's solo career. Not that that's a bad thing, but that element was starting to really creep in. It was getting harder and harder to differentiate between Roxy Music and Brian Ferry's solo career. And what you started to get with this album is cover songs. And one thing that Brian Ferry is famous for, maybe more famous in certain circles to a degree, is his cover songs, which is a bit of a shame, I suppose, to a certain degree, because he is a great songwriter, Brian Ferry, And but you know, he is a great coverer of other people's material as well, so it's kind of 50-50 really. And yeah, this came out in 1980. Another cover song that uh, Roxy Music did around this time doesn't appear on this album. I guess they did it later on. One of the more memorable uh, sort of tributes, I guess, to John Lennon. At least I feel like it's the case anyway. Is you know they covered "Jealous Guy," so yeah, it's sort of this is the start of the cover era of Roxy Music. You know, I always think of Roxy Music very much of Brian Ferry writing most of the lyrics and the other guys doing helping out with the music and I guess some of the lyrics as well to a certain degree. But yeah, this is like the most covery period really of Roxy Music, and it's not a particularly great period really of Roxy Music. They were kind of just going through the emotions. You know, they kind of passed their peak. I feel like at this point in time, but they were still putting out a pretty good album. This is a decent one. But I'd say I'd check this out towards the end. If you're a completionist, maybe put this one on the back burner until you've listened to all the Roxy Music albums. And one last note I want before I move on to the next album is the cover. I always feel slightly slightly sorry for the lady on the back there. You know, she always most versions anyway she's cropped out. You know, there is a few versions I've noticed where she is on the she is on the front cover, but yeah, most of them she's sort of cropped out. It's a bit of a shame. You've got three sort of javelins there or whatever they are, you know, and only two people holding them, and she's got the other. But anyway, we'll move on. We'll move on to number 7 of 8. You know, my seventh most favorite Roxy music, or my second to last least favorite, I guess you could say, is I've gone for a controversial one. It's Avalon. Now this is controversial for many reasons. Well, a handful of reasons, should I say? Not a whole heap of reasons, but it's partly because I do know that this is many people's favorite Roxy music album. In fact, I read on a forum once somebody saying that not only is this their favorite Roxy music album, but this is the only one they like. They don't like any other Roxy music album. So yeah, kind of a difference of opinion there to say the least. And also, this is Roxy Music's most commercially successful album. This one did, I believe, pretty well in America at the time. You know, back in '82, I believe this album came out, and it's the only Roxy Music album, as far as I'm aware, anyway, to do pretty well in America. They never really did that great over there. I guess that's why their legacy maybe isn't as big as it maybe should be. I feel like they kind of deserve because they never really did amazingly well over in America. They were huge, or pretty big anyway, in the UK. I feel like the UK was like the main backbone really of their support. All the countries as well, they were pretty popular, but they didn't really strike out in America until this album. And I guess it was very tempting for them to follow it up with another one at that point, but they didn't. I feel like Brian Ferry kind of used the momentum from this album to fuel this kind of solo career really at this point on, and that's kind of the issue that I have with this album is it's not a big issue. Like I said, I do like all of these albums, but I do feel like as well that when Roxy Music started out in 1972, they were 100% Roxy Music. They were a band. Brian Ferry was the main man, of course. He was the main guy pulling all the strings to a certain degree. He was lead singer. He was writing the vast majority of the music and the songs and everything and that kind of thing. And he was designing their costumes and on stage and designing their album covers. He's the main guy. Without Brian Ferry, there would not be Roxy Music. It's as simple as that. He is the key guy. The other guys are important, but Brian Ferry is the key guy. At this point in time, the lines between Brian Ferry's solo career and Roxy Music really began to merge into one, and even more so than with Flesh and Blood. And this to me feels too much like Brian Ferry's Avalon rather than Roxy Music's Avalon. Not that that's a bad thing, of course, but I always feel like this is a band apart from everything else that Roxy Music pour out, and it just doesn't have the correct kind of attitude, as far as I'm concerned, for a Roxy Music album. I always feel like Roxy Music were a very vibrant, in-your-face band. You think of stuff like Virginia Plain, Love is the Drug, even. Do the Strand. You know, these are songs that you can't really ignore. You know, they grab your attention, they force you to go along with the journey and that kind of thing. This album is very subtle, it's very nuanced, it's very delicate. It doesn't really have any of that element of early Roxy music, and I feel like it's too much a band apart. It's too much of a separation from what I consider to be the sound of Roxy music. But there is some good things about this album, without a shadow of doubt. Really, the production is fantastic. It's regarded by many to be not only one of, but the greatest produced pop albums of all time. You know, just in terms of the sound quality, it's just, you know, generally speaking, pretty much all Roxy music is fantastically well recorded. Besides the first album, which is a bit dodgy in places, but generally they're all fantastic. And this is like the cherry on the cake. You know, it's supremely well recorded album, supremely well mastered and everything. Also, it's got a track on here called More Than This. It's the opening track and it's fantastic. Arguably one of the best songs of the entire 1980s. If you watch the video, Brian Ferry, at one point he's wearing a dressy white shirt with a black dicky bow tie, and he's wearing a leather jacket. And there's not many guys who can get away with doing that. So yeah, this is Manifesto from 1979, and this album came out at a time when Roxy music, they went on a bit of a hiatus, from 1975 to 1979, a bit of a gap there. And I guess there was many Roxy music fans at the time, maybe fearing that Roxy music had broken off. You know, they weren't going to record together anymore. And then he came up with this, and a lot had happened in the couple of years since they'd been away. You know, punk had happened, disco had happened, and this is really a test for Roxy music, is to come back and to kind of, fit in, I guess, and not just be left behind, and this is a test that they very much passed at this point. This is a strong album. This is an album that fits the period very well. They've become a little bit more poppy at this point, a bit more softer, a bit more poppy, a bit disco-y as well, this album, to a certain degree. And it fits very well. It's almost like they hadn't been gone, and they were able to come back and put out not only a good album, but an album that fits the period. They didn't look like they were, abandoned the wrong period, that maybe should have split up. They come back and they had something to say and something to do, and they put out a very good album. This is a strong release, and side 2 of this album in particular, West Side as it's known, is very good. I feel like it's a very consistent side. Side 1's pretty good as well, or East Side's pretty good, and consistent, strong album. Just not as good as their earlier efforts, really. And I do really like the cover as well. I think the cover is one of the more interesting Roxy music album covers. In fact, I think it is the most interesting of all of them, because it's just something about it, really. It's just sort of, it's kind of freaky, it's kind of interesting, it kind of says certain things maybe about society at the time. And there's a lot to read into it, really, which I'm not going to get into. But yeah, very good album and a very good cover and a good comeback for Roxy music back in 1979. So we'll move on to album number, we're up to now 5 of 8, Upper Level. I've gone for Siren. This is the album that came out before Manifesto, and this is like the final Roxy music album of their classic period, really, the classic rock era. And really from this album onwards, I would highly recommend, if you see any of these albums out in the wild, pick them up. If that's your thing, or you're on eBay or whatever it is, you're just looking for something to listen to on Spotify, whatever it is. This is the point where you really need to check out. This is like the golden era of Roxy music. Although having said that, I feel like they were riding a wave, or perhaps the wave was with the beach in the background and everything. I believe this is Anglesey with Jerry Hall there. But anyway, I believe the wave was kind of on its way down rather than on the way up, really. And the fact that they went on a hiatus after this album, no band goes on a hiatus if things are going fantastically well. There must have been perhaps something going on which wasn't really. Maybe they were just a bit sick of each other at this point in time. They went their separate ways to a certain degree, and there was Roxy music were poor and ice for a few years, and that's kind of a sign to me that things weren't all that great. But this is a consistent, strong, very good album. There's nothing bad about this album musically whatsoever. A very good album overall and well worth checking out. And yeah, it's a good one. So we'll move on to, and it opens with "Love Is the Drug." What more do you need than that? It's worth buying the album just for that one song alone. And there's other great stuff on it as well. But yeah, that is a classic, one of the best tracks really of the 1970s, you could argue. So I'll move on to number 4, record 4 of 8. So in the getting to the top records now of Roxy Music, and this is Stranded, the third Roxy Music album, and this is the first one without Brian Eno. And any other group that would have lost a musical genius such as Brian Eno would have perhaps a lesser group would have fallen by the wayside and been exposed as frauds and that kind of thing. But Roxy Music was such a great band. I feel like this album's very similar in many ways, not musically or anything like that, to but it's similar in the sense that it's like Manifesto. Really, it's a test. Manifesto was a test to come back after a hiatus. This album was a test to see if Roxy Music could cut it after Brian and they definitely could. And it's really the best outcome that could have happened after Brian left the group. They ditched to a certain degree a lot of the experimentation that their earlier 2 albums had but to a certain degree they kept an element of it. You could almost assume that Brian had worked on elements of this album, but he didn't. He had nothing to do with this album whatsoever. I think it's very clever what they did. They knew he was a popular guy. He was a very popular member of the group when they were touring and everything like that. And they knew that there was something about the earliest material before this that they couldn't just completely disregard. So they kept an element of it behind, and it does have a slight Eno element to this. And I believe actually this is Eno's favorite Roxy Music album. So yeah, it's definitely got a little bit of it's definitely got a little remnants of Eno there, even though he's not he didn't do anything on this album, he didn't work on this album, but they kind of got the balance right really effectively, and they changed direction. They become a lot more commercial sounding, I guess, to a degree. They ditched quite a lot of the experimentation, and it was kind of onwards and upwards. Really, there was no holding back. Now they were really starting to get somewhere effectively, and it was a big hit in the UK. Their album, I believe there was a time I remember going through record shop, you could just find loads of copies of that. Maybe things are a bit different now, but anyway, we'll move on to my third most favorite Roxy Music. So we're in the top 3 now. Gone for this. It's Selftitled, 1972. Their debut album, an iconic album with a very iconic 1970, early 70s album cover, and it's probably one of the more iconic sort of debut albums of all time, really. And they really hit the ground running with this. They were just so different, really. There was just nothing really quite like them at the time. In fact, I have heard Brian Ferry, in interviews, he said that at these very early days of Roxy Music, they thought that Roxy Music wouldn't really get anywhere. They'd have a limited amount of success, effectively, and that was kind of it, really. They wouldn't really become a big band or achieve that much. It was just maybe a sort of a stepping stone, perhaps, and to move on to other things. Didn't expect them to be all that successful, and they did. They had some pretty, more success than Brian Ferry, I guess, anticipated. And I feel like the reason for that is because they got the balance right between the record buying population at the time in the UK, especially, and other countries as well. There was the kind of critical listeners, the guys who were into art rock and into progressive rock, and there was the more casual, radio-friendly listeners at the time as well. And they got the balance right. They didn't alienate one side of the record buying population. They kind of kept both of them, on their side effectively, which is something that's not easy to do. It's something that they could have quite easily messed up, but they did it very well. And this is a strong weird at times, a bit silly album at times, you could almost argue, but there's quality running through it, and it's a solid album that really does showcase a lot of the talent. You know, even the opening track, you know, he gets a little bit of a solo and that kind of thing, and it kind of feels like, you know, this is a band. You know, this is almost the opposite really of Avalon. You know, this feels like Roxy Music, the band, and Avalon feels like Brian Ferry plus support sort of thing. You know, this is the tail end, you know, of that sort of feel, I suppose. You know, and it is the tail end of the discography as well. So anyway, great debut, and well worth checking out if you haven't done so already. And we'll move on to my second most favourite. So two, you know, second of eight, I suppose. You know, two of eight. If that makes any sense. And it's For Your Pleasure, the second album to be released by Roxy Music. And yeah, fine album. This is great follow up to the first album, a little bit better recorded. You know, if you listen to the first album in terms of the recording quality, and then listen to this is almost like, I feel like this is what they wanted the first album to sound like. It's the most experimental album that Roxy Music put out. Definitely the darkest album Roxy Music put out in terms of their, you know, the tone of the album. It's probably the darkest in terms of the cover as well. You know, slightly strange, slightly sleazy album cover, and yeah, it's a bit sleazy as well in terms of the material. You know, you get some pretty dark corners in this album, and it kind of it's the album that they really kind of get maybe few of the things out of the system. You know, the darkness, the experimentation, and they kind of really ramp her up. And towards this, you know, the end of this album, it kind of goes absolutely crazy, and you kind of think, what the hell's going on? But they still didn't manage to, you know, alienate the you know, the more casual listeners, as I was talking about before. You know, they were still on board, and they managed to do that even though this album goes nuts in places, through you know, keeping that commercial side in. You know, they had a couple of commercial tracks here and there, so they didn't alienate people, even though they maybe pushed them pretty hard with this album. But yeah, it's a fine album, right? You know, beautifully put together. It's the best of the early stuff, effectively. You know, the very early, you know, stuff. This is the best with Eno on board and that kind of thing. This is the, you know, this is the you know, if they'd have carried on at this point, you know, they could have gone a different route. They could have kept this experimental edge, or they could have gone the way they ended up going, which is a more mainstream sound. And it kind of would have been interesting to hear, you know, in a different dimension, you know, if Eno would have stuck around maybe. But, you know, it was great either way. So we'll move on to my favourite Roxy Music album, number one, the album I consider to be the best. And it's Country Life, the fourth studio album from Roxy Music. And the reason why I've gone for this as my favourite is the cover. No other reason, but, you know, just the cover. No, but the reason why I've gone for this as my favourite, I feel like Roxy Music were kind of leading somewhere with Roxy Music, and you know, they were going somewhere. They were heading towards a direction, and they were going for a peak, I guess. You know, they were you know, getting in their stride, and they were warming up, and they kind of hit it with this album. This album is kind of like faultless, really. I remember the first time I listened to it, and I listened to side one about 5 or 6 times, and I was kind of, if anything, a bit apprehensive to listen to side two, because side one was just so great. You know, I thought it could never live up to side one, and it does live up. And it was kind of like, wow, this is, you know, Roxy. You know, I wasn't expecting this album to be as good as it was, you know, because I really liked the first couple of albums, and then this was just like, this just takes it to the next level, really. And it's just an amazing album that they put together. You know, just like there's not an inch of this album that's been wasted. You know, every second's kind of utilized, and there's effects in this that, you know, I kind of blows your mind, really, of production and of songwriting, and of, you know, it's got the experimental edge in it as well. It's kind of like everything just kind of clicked into place, and they just came up with a truly great album. And it's the most, I think it's the most accessible quality album that the Roxy Music ever put out. And really, the only thing I can kind of maybe count against it really. You know, I was kind of joking about the cover being the best thing about it, but it's the only thing that, you know, is maybe detracts from the album to a degree. You know, it's something that's, you know, I think it's overly controversial to, you know, to say the least, shall we say, and it maybe distracts from the music that the album has. In fact, I have seen modern pressings of this album, you know, in HMV, you know, brand new pressings, and they've gone for, you know, they've gone for the censored cover. You know, they've gone for this on the front with just, you know, Roxy Music, Country Life on it, and that kind of thing. And you know, after all these years, you know, after, you know, all these years that have passed, you know, it's still a controversial. In fact, it's probably more controversial now than it was back, at least in the UK. Anyway, it's more controversial now than it was back in the 1970s. So yeah, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. You know, reanalyze things and that kind of thing. But it's musically, just focus on the music, and it's great. It really is. It's a superb album, and I consider it to be the best of Roxy Music. Even though I love the, you know, For Your Pleasure, I think this one just has the edge, and it's just like Roxy Music at the absolute peak. So that's it for my fairly long, I apologize, ranking video. But yeah, it's something I wanted to do for a while now. Finally got around to doing it, and yeah, if you want any more ranking videos, just drive past me and shout ranker, ranker, and you know, I'll be there to make another one. So here's to another 50 years of Roxy Music. I doubt we're going to get it, unfortunately. I would like another 50 years of Roxy Music, but I doubt we're going to get it. I think Brian Ferry will probably be about 130 or something, but I can only dream. So thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.